What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more New Order. And I'd like to thank a couple people at the top of this video. First of all, I'd like to thank Chris, who actually has shared more music with me than I realized. Indeed, he recently messaged me that he was going to send me another electronic album, which I'm very excited about. It means we have another chapter in the electronic journey to go through, as well as some Monaco/Peter Hook, which I don't know much about, but ultimately I understand it to be related to the electronic New Order, I guess Joy Division, like nexus of artists. And ultimately, when I went to retrieve those, I noticed there's a whole bunch of other folders that he shared with me that I had not been aware of. And indeed, in the last few weeks, I've been trying to catch up on things that people have shared that I haven't gotten around to or wasn't even aware of, things on drives, attachments in emails, and so on. And one of the other folders that Chris has shared is for New Order. Now, at the same time, I'd like to give a big thank you to Erik, who mentioned to me recently that there's another physical copy of a New Order album, I think, on its way to me. It hasn't arrived yet, so I don't know quite what to say about it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But in the meantime, I figured we could go through some more New Order while we wait for that to arrive. So one of the albums in there was a 1993 album called Republic. I think it's just Republic. Maybe it's The Republic. Let me get a quick check here. Yeah, it's just Republic from 1993. And the first tune is Regret. So yeah, I guess we'll go through this for the time being and we'll adjust as needed once I get that physical album. So once again, big shout out to both Chris and to Erik. So Regret. It's a single word title, but of course the meaning of the word is pretty clear. Wishing you hadn't done something, wishing something hadn't happened in a certain way. So I suppose regret can be more direct in terms of your own actions or in terms of external circumstances, maybe even random happenstance. But I think typically you refer to your own mistaken or ignorant or emotional actions that didn't turn out the way you wanted with regret. So I think regret is actually a self-criticism in most articulations of the concept. So yes, given that a lot of songs in general, maybe specifically with groups, from the 80s and 90s, and in fact that's, I feel, an oversimplification, meaning, 60s, 70s, I suppose any era that you talk about, love is one of the fundamental concepts of the human experience and thus one of the major facets of all manner of art, not just music. Nevertheless, the point is, I would maybe predict, hypothesize perhaps better, that this might be regret in terms of an interpersonal relationship or dynamic, and maybe someone said something or did something that caused a schism that led to a breakup or at least tainted a previously better relationship. So again, that's just a very loose speculation, but let's see what it is in practice. This is New Order, the track is Regret, and it's from their 1993 album, Republic. It is quite insane, and of course, we're talking about over a decade of time here, but to think of how different something like that sounds than the Movement album, and maybe even a fair amount of the stuff on the Substance compilation, though at the same time, I'd say there are tracks on Substance, including the Bizarre Love Triangle, that sound closer to this. And by this, I mean it sounds mostly like a emotional and, let's say, softer synth rock tune with some 80s vibes, which again, early 90s, late 80s, they sort of bleed into each other, even though in retrospect, and I say this as a historian, we like to divide periods of time into clear little self-contained units which with their own characteristics, which is of course an oversimplification and is largely more about didactic utility than actual past events and experiences. In any case, I would just say there's also a hint of like a dance floor sound. It's like that fast percussion maybe gives that to me. Now it doesn't sound dance floor in the like 80s synth pop, much more electronic sound of something like Blue Monday, but yeah, it's sort of like emotional ballad-esque synth rock tune mixed with a bit of dance flavor. And lyrically, I'm fascinated because it sounds like there's almost regret in both directions. Like he's saying right out of the gate, which I was a bit amused by, that like I'm not gonna have any regrets. I don't remember the addresses of all the people I've known, but I'm not gonna regret that. So it was almost like, oh wait, so regret is like the foil. It's the thing that's being cast as the opposite or the opposing factor. But then he's saying like, you used to be a perfect stranger and now you're very much in my mind. So it sounds like maybe he is regretting the fact that his emotions are no longer in his control. That used to be this other person, but now that he's gotten to know them, now that they've gotten into his heart and into his mind, he's a bit more at the whim of the fates or the ebbs and flows, the vicissitudes of love. So I don't know if I'm reading that right, but certainly the warm, rich, kind of enveloping feeling of the Sonics conveyed this idea to me that maybe he's infatuated, maybe it's someone who he's now like fixated on, and he sort of regrets that. So maybe regret is functioning in both directions in the tune. There's definitely some lines that I didn't catch clearly, so one I'll have to re-listen to. I obviously look forward to people's comments. But yeah, again, you can tell this is an evolved New Order sound. It doesn't sound certainly like Movement or, again, even some of the Substance compilation, but there's still continuity, certainly with multiple tracks I've heard from them, and maybe a hint that like it's still that late 80s, early 90s styling, but maybe moving toward a more like evolved 90s type of sound. So either way, as I said, I'm very much looking forward to the physical release from Erik arriving. Once again, big shout out to Chris for sharing a couple things more recently, which brought to my attention that there's actually a lot of stuff waiting. So again, on a long enough timeline, we'll go through it all. I beg for your patience and understanding. Do let me know what you think of this track, and I will see you next time. Peace.